All right, cool. So we'll move into the second session now um, with Andrew Kerr going to bring in some labor market ideas for us. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, so my name's Andrew. I work here at the University of Cape Town. My primary affiliation is actually the School of Economics, but I am affiliated with SALDRU also. I am mostly still a labor economist, but I have kind of wound my way into thinking about urban transport mainly, and I guess I'm being asked to speak about urban labor markets. So, talk outline. So, I was a little bit surprised at the diversity of people. I was thinking I was going to be talking to mostly PhD and master's students in economics, with some practitioners. But it seems like there's quite more diversity in the room in terms of what people are doing. So who's in the room? That's my question to you, just to briefly say who I am in the room. So as I said, I'm a labor economist. I did my PhD in labor, focusing on South Africa and Tanzania. I'm South African. And I ended up getting into kind of, broadly speaking, urban economics through an interest in transport, commuting costs, and minibus taxis. So I've spent a lot of time traveling around minibuses in Cape Town and other parts of South Africa, trying to find out how that part of Cape Town's economy works. So yeah, I'm a micro labor economist, but definitely interested in transport. So if I can just ask, who's a PhD student? Okay, master students? Great, okay. Practitioners? Cool, okay. Great. And who considers themselves to be an economist? Okay. Who considers themselves to be a labor economist? Okay. Me and you are. Okay. The session may not have been so well targeted, but anyway, let's see how we go. So I was also told no technical stuff, so I don't have any equations or complicated mathematics, but I am talking about kind of the details of some of these models and ideas in labor economics. So I'll try and adjust a little bit to make sure it's a bit more accessible to everyone, and maybe skip over some of the details. Anyone doing macro? Like one lonely macroeconomist? Two, okay, be brave. 3, okay. 4, all right, okay. Yeah, so as I said, primarily micro and labor. Sorry, mustn't touch my face. When I went to the UK to do a PhD, in the very first few weeks I was there, I went to a bookshop which was closing down. That was kind of like an interesting kind of foreshadowing of what was to come in the world. I bought a book on the UK history because I was like, well, I'm here, don't know much about the UK, let me buy this book on history. And I've subsequently, over the few years that I was there 5 years, figured out that that was a terrible book. It really gave me very little about the history of the UK. And why I say that is because one of the good things about doing a PhD was learning from people what to read. So in the process of preparing this talk, I've tried to do that, is to give you some like guides, signposts for where to go. And I hope that's helpful. If it's not, well, I'm sure there'll be lots of other good talks. Yeah, I really think that is valuable. Part of the process of learning and figuring out where to go is learning from other people. And I don't know a huge amount, but I know something, and I'm hoping that I'll provide you with some references and things. So mine's way more details and way less high level than Ivan's very helpful introductory presentation. I do have a few slides on some big picture statistics. So I got these from World Development Indicators. So 50% of workers, or just under, in African economies are working in agriculture. So if you're thinking about urban economics, we're kind of setting aside a big chunk of people who are most people in subsistence agriculture, not all, but most are working in urban areas, in rural areas. So if we're thinking about urban economics, we're sort of setting aside 50% of people who work in agriculture, most of whom are working in rural areas. Urban population has increased, as we heard from Ivan, from 15% in 1960 to 43% 2 years ago. And the share of wage and salary work, according to World Development Indicators, is only 23%. So when we're thinking about a labor market, we're thinking about people, if you're from a rich country, you're from South Africa, perhaps, or other countries at higher levels of development, we think about a market in terms of people buying and selling their labor. So I'm a worker, I want to work, I sell my labor to somebody who wants to buy my labor and use me in their business. So that kind of breaks down if you think that only 23% of people are doing that. Most people are selling their labor to themselves as self-employed in small businesses, or they're working in subsistence agriculture. So that's just kind of like, well, you know, what does it mean to study labor economics in a place where most people are not actually working for somebody else? That's kind of a theme running through a lot of research in labor economics. And within urban areas, even then, only maybe 55% is wage work, mostly informal. And if you're talking about formal sector, where there might be a contract or payment of unemployment insurance or something like that, or the firm itself is registered, that's kind of much smaller. Most of wage work is informal, and of the formal work that there is, thank you. Most of the formal work that there is, a lot of it is done for the state, so between 40 and 50%. So if you're talking about the formal sector, like private labor market, that's pretty small. Okay, so urbanization and structural transformation go together. The process in which ideally an economy moves from mostly rural agriculture into manufacturing and then into services, and that's happened in most middle and rich income countries around the world. And that's led to declines in people in agriculture, shifting out into manufacturing industries and services. And in that kind of stylized picture of where the world has been or is going, urbanization is kind of a sign of economic growth, a movement away from low productivity agriculture, a smaller and smaller fraction of people being involved in agriculture, and people moving into to manufacturing and services. And as Ivan said in lots of different ways, I'll just say in a few, urbanization is a good thing in itself. Not just a sign of progress away from low productivity agriculture, in the sense that agglomeration is important, increasing returns, the benefits of firms locating near other firms and workers. So that's where kind of labor comes in. We have the labor market. It's good for firms to locate near other firms. That has external benefits other than just to those firms. We've got lots of firms and lots of workers working in the same area that can generate externalities. The one concern, there's a literature saying, as Ivan said in different ways, different trajectory of some African cities, or perhaps many. Urbanization without structural transformation, or you could think of it as Remy Jedwab and Douglas Collin and other people have talked about consumption cities. So rather than cities being sites of production, of growth, as evidence of movement away from agriculture-based towards high productivity manufacturing or services, mostly just relying on rents rather than generating productive growth. So then the question is, well, are these positive forces of urbanization absent? Are they just much less? And that's kind of an important question. So not too much labor there, but a little bit firms and workers. So what does urban labor economics mean? That can mean a lot of things. if we just confine ourselves to urban areas. We just think about ourselves as labor economists, not that many of you are, but if I think of myself as a labor economist, this is what I did in my PhD. Because so much of rural work is subsistence agriculture, I'm just going to set that aside, and in my case, think about workers choosing between wage employment and self-employment. And that was kind of urban Tanzania. But not necessarily much more than that, just saying we're going to focus on urban mostly to exclude agriculture, which, yeah. The second possibility is thinking about labor markets in space. So where are jobs and where are people? Differences in outcomes in space. Some areas have highly productive firms. Workers travel there to work. They live somewhere else. Maybe they live close. Maybe they live far away. And perhaps differences in outcomes. Some areas have very high rates of unemployment, and some areas have much lower rates of unemployment, higher earnings, etc. It might also mean thinking about how people get to work, the cost of getting to work, and the cost of looking for work. It could mean thinking about the state of public transport, commuting options, how do people get to work, and the decision of whether to work far from home or near. A third possibility that I'm not going to say much about, thinking about labor and land markets. So my choice of where to work and where to live. So if you are an urban economist or you know much about it, some people think that urban labor economics is only 0.3. Sorry, that is not my area of expertise. And the organizers knew that when they asked me to speak on this topic. So I'm assuming that you can't be too disappointed, or you should blame them rather than me. Okay, so how urban labor markets model, I left out actually option 0, which is perfect competition. Maybe you know that from studying first year economics. Kind of the labor market functions perfectly well, market's clear, there are no problems, there's perfect information, no frictions in the labor market. And so I don't have anything more to say about that other than I'm not going to talk about it. Okay, so the first one that people think about urban labor markets in Africa kind of started by Harris and Tudaro, paper from 1970. And what they tried to do is think about urban rural migration and the existence both of migration to urban areas and also high levels of urban unemployment. So why is it that the labor market is not clearing? We should think that wages should just adjust downwards. If there's unemployment, the unemployed want to work. So why don't that push of more unemployed people lower wages? And they hypothesized that things like minimum wages or perhaps a dominant, as I mentioned before, public sector where wages are high for some other reason is preventing wages declining a bit to make the labor market clear. And so that's how you can get both people moving, even when there's from rural areas where they're assumed to be working in subsistence agriculture to urban areas and unemployment at the same time. And then a step beyond that is a paper by Fields, 1975. He called it the murky sector. I'm not sure if he regrets using that funny word, but anyway, we could think about this as the informal sector. And in that sense, there's now another option. Instead of just people waiting for relatively well-paying wage jobs in a large firm or in the public sector, they might be working, as I'm sure all of you know, in some informal business, either for themselves or for somebody else. And so that's kind of a bit more realistic. People have other options rather than just waiting in unemployment for a high-paying job. And there's a nice summary of this in Fields 2011. So there's a huge literature that's been spawned by this, including one of my papers that I wrote quite a long time ago in my PhD on segmented labor markets. Do people who look the same identically in all other ways get paid different amounts in the formal and informal sector? Is there some kind of mechanism that's preventing wages from equalizing in those two sectors? And these are still being used. There's this paper by Rudd and Trapetsnikova from a few years ago, thinking about differences between, in their case, wage and self-employment in the urban labor market, but that uses what's called search and matching theory, which I'll get to in the next slide. Okay, so this is a theory of how labor markets work that's taken from rich countries. And the main idea, in perfect competition, markets clear instantaneously. There's lots of information flowing around. And in this case, we have what are called frictions that prevents markets from clearing instantaneously and information from flowing well. So this is a term borrowed from physics, like there's a friction that prevents something from moving, and in this case prevents something from, like information from flowing around. Where are jobs? Where are opportunities that this information doesn't flow freely? And it takes time, therefore, to find a job or to find an employee if you're a firm. And one of the things that this way of dealing with labor markets means is that flows between states are very important. So Alan Manning has a funny story in the introduction to his book, Monopsony in Motion, where he says, well, in perfect competition, if you get a job, you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, that was expected. And also, if you lose your job, you shrug your shoulders and you say, well, that was also expected, but I'll find one pretty much instantly. So don't worry. And he compares that to, well, actually, in real life, if you get a job, you go to the pub and you celebrate. And if you lose your job, you also go to the pub and you drown your sorrows. Funny, way of thinking about the difference between competitive markets and these kind of search models. And this paper by two winners of the Nobel Prize a few years ago, Mortensen and Pissarides, summarizes this approach to thinking about labor markets. So, as I mentioned, flows are important. Movements between states are important. If I lose my job, it's going to take me time probably to find another one, maybe lots of time. And certainly in South Africa, it might take a lot of time. And so this recent paper by Donovan and co-authors uses panel surveys. You need a panel. You need to track the same people over time because you want to think about their outcomes now and their outcomes, in their case, mostly 3 or 6 months later. So is there a lot of movement between jobs, or are most people like stuck in their jobs for a long period of time? And what they find, interestingly, is flows are worker flows, movements between jobs, between unemployment and work, between work and unemployment or not economically active, are double in the lower middle income countries that they study compared to their high income countries, in their sample. So economists, many of you are not economists, but economists often think that flexible labor markets are good. It's good to have the ability to move between work if you're an employee, to not be stuck, and also if you're an employer, to not have to keep somebody on if you don't need to. And so there's lots of evidence from rich countries that richer countries are ones that have more flexible labor markets. And what they say is that actually that's not true when you think about, when you broaden the scope to not just richer countries, but you also think about lower middle income countries, that these high worker flows, flexibility in the labor market doesn't generate good outcomes for workers or for firms. I don't know if you ever played the game Snakes and Ladders as a kid. You roll the dice, you move along, you might go up a ladder, and then you move along, and then you get a snake, and then you have to go down again and start at the beginning. The person who wins is the one who gets to the top corner. And so they have, and others have used the term slippery job ladders. So it kind of gets this idea of snakes and ladders, that many people in lower or middle income countries have jobs which they can climb up, and then very quickly they go down again. And so in that sense, there's flows. I get into a job maybe fairly quickly, but then 3 months later, for many people, their experience is they're out of that job and they're either in unemployment or in another job, or they're in self-employment, something like that. Okay. And what they say is that there have been people sort of motivating why low income countries have poor labor market performance, is that there may be lots of costs to moving, either from the firm side to perhaps fire a worker, or from a worker side, it's costly to, so for example, move from a rural area to an urban area. So they said this, if there's lots of flows, doesn't seem like costs are preventing people from moving. Okay, and there's lots of kind of area, fairly recent area in labor economics thinking about matching signals. So if I go to you and I want to work for you, you're trying to figure out, okay, this guy has secondary education. Is it good? Is it bad? Is this person going to be a good worker? Maybe in lower income countries, that signal of am I good or am I not? I hand my CV. What can you judge from my CV? Maybe you can't judge anything, or it's very difficult to tell. If my exam grades are just random, if that's my education system, then maybe you can't tell, maybe I'm going to be a terrible worker. And so then in that case, well, I hire somebody, but then I quickly find out this person is not the right person for the job that I'm in, and then that person, the match ends, and this happens all over the labor market, and you end up with these higher flows. One possibility. Okay, I mentioned frictions, so some of these are to do with space and urban economics, and some of them are not. So as I mentioned, information can travel through space, and it can do that better or worse. It costs money and time to search for a job, so you don't just get one, shrug your shoulders, I got a job, expect it, and move on. And it's also psychologically costly, especially if you haven't had a job for a long time, or you've had a bad job for a long time. It's costly to try and get up energy to look for a better one or a new one. It's also possible that workers might have incorrect beliefs about the jobs that are available and their own possibilities about getting jobs. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And as I mentioned, one of the possibilities is that workers can't easily signal. If I'm a brilliant worker, you can't tell just by looking at my CV. Maybe, as I mentioned, my secondary school grades are not an accurate reflection of how good I'm going to be. And then also possibly credit markets don't work. So perhaps if I'm a really good worker and I can signal this, I should be able to, say, borrow money if I don't have any, to be able to spend time searching for a good job. If that's not possible, then I'm kind of limited. I can't move to the right place. So some of these are about actual distance, like distance in space. And so often urban labor economics is kind of thinking about matching these search models and space together. And if you want to talk about space, that also means thinking about land markets, housing, distance to work, rents. And I'm not going to say much about that. There's a nice complicated theory book by Zenu 2009 that talks about land and labor markets. Okay. So as I mentioned, but just to recap, if we're thinking about frictions in the labor market, that's often about information, firms and workers, people finding jobs, finding information about jobs. If most people in subsistence agriculture, it doesn't really make sense to think about search matching frictions in labor markets in that context. Okay, so 55% of urban employment is wage employment from Cunningham. So that's sort of getting to the point now where we can sensibly think about matching frictions and matching between firms and workers if more than half of employment is in wage employment. Okay, I'm going to talk about some work on frictions in the labor market. Okay, so first of all, search. You don't shrug your shoulders when you get a job. It's time-consuming and costly to search, and probably you go to the pub and have a drink and to celebrate with your friends if you did find one. And firms also, on the firm side, they also face challenges to recruit. So there's a paper by sort of summary paper, Kerr et al. 2024, thinking about different kinds of barriers to specifically to search for firms and for workers. And one of the things they focus on is search costs. They have some quite stark statistics. Median job search expenditure in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia for active job seekers was 16% of their monthly expenditure. So people were spending a lot of money looking for work, and that's just money, time also, and as I mentioned, other costs too. And in South Africa, the mean search costs were 18% of total earnings for those who are employed. So that's also interesting. I've talked about searches. I don't have a job, I'm going to look for one, but also there are a lot of people who are doing on-the-job search. So these people are they're doing some work, maybe not full time, but they're then spending quite a lot of time on average, money, well, I guess, and time, spending money getting around looking for work. It's a paper by Kerr et al. And Abebe is the one for Ethiopia. Okay, and they mentioned some other things that I'll get to shortly. Okay, so this is a paper for South Africa, for Urban, Joburg, Banerjee, and Sequeira, thinking about spatial mismatch. So young people in Soweto, township outside central Joburg, and thinking about a few things. That it costs lots of money to go from an outlying area into town to look for work, and also jobs are far away. Or kind of interesting idea that they raise is that people might not know what's out there if they're a long way from jobs and if it costs lots of money to get there. So in which case, who knows what's out there? So one of the things that they find is that when this is a randomized control trial, they gave some people a subsidy, transport subsidy. And they found that people did use the money that they got to travel into town and look for work, but they also found that it lowered people's expectations about what they were going to find and how much the jobs were going to pay. So, if you're far away and you can't get into town, maybe you think, I've got a good chance of getting a good job. But actually, if you go into town, you walk the street, you drop your CV off at lots of places, you end up finding that the jobs that are available are not very well paying, potentially. These are people with just secondary schooling, so not like university graduates or anything. So the jobs were not paying very much. They might be, only for a very short period of time, and it costs lots of money to get there. And so in that sense, they found something which they don't say was disappointing. They, as economists usually do, they say, well, this is actually the interesting finding of our paper. Forget about it doing the thing that we wished it did, which was raise employment. They just say, actually, it didn't help anyone get jobs, but it kind of made some people get jobs closer to home and changed people's beliefs, expectations about what job finding was. So in some sense, that's kind of disappointing paper, in the sense of if we wanted policy to work, maybe we should subsidize people's transport from out of town or out of on the periphery into central business districts. That didn't seem to have worked in their paper. And it was this the combination of two things, that people were far from jobs, didn't have the right information, that led to well, that was part of the explanation for why people weren't finding work, had these, So another, okay, well, we should think about public transport and subsidizing public transport if people can't borrow. If they want to look for work, maybe there are jobs available. So this paper on Ethiopia did something a little similar, but they basically found short-run impact of transport subsidies. So in the short run, okay, great, but they went and tracked these people 4 years later, which is quite impressive, and they found that basically there was no difference between the people who were given the subsidy for a short period of time. So you can imagine if you get a subsidy, maybe you get into work, and then you're on the ladder part of snakes and ladders, and we can link that back to the other paper showing, yes, in the short run it had some positive benefits, people were in employment, but 4 years later they were kind of at the same point on the snakes and ladders board as the people who weren't given a transport study in their experiment. Okay, what they did find is a long-lasting effect of certifying skills. So they basically invited young people in, made them do a bunch of tests, and then stamped something to say, this organization says that this person is very skilled at doing X, Y, Z. And it turns out that certifying did have important effects, long-term effects on people. So that's okay, there are frictions. It's not about transport subsidies, but there are information frictions that once those are overcome can have positive benefits to people who really are skilled, but weren't able to credibly signal that to employers beforehand. Okay, but now the source of frictions, we've got to think about commuting costs. I'm sure even if you're not an economist, you know lots about transport. Costs of getting around are important friction, not just for search, but also going to work. And that's something that I've spent time on in my own research, thinking about transport costs in South African cities. If there's lots of sprawl, if there's bad public transport or no public transport, this can mean that commuting costs are large. So examine this for South Africa. Very large costs of time, basically much higher. I think average commute times in South Africa are double the US, which has a reputation as for having like not such good public transport and lots of car travel, congestion, etc. So average commute times are double, and those have increased between 1993 and 2013. So costs increased by, on average, that's at the median increased by about 50% over that 20-year period, like first 20 years of democracy. Okay, and probably, although the surveys are not so good at this, the increase in median earnings was quite a bit lower than this. So sure, earnings these are both adjusting for inflation. So sure, people's earnings on average was increasing a little bit, at least the median was increasing, but the costs increased more than this. So basically people are a bit poorer when you consider their 20 years later, when you consider the fact that sure, their earnings increased, but commuting also increased. Commuting costs also increased. And commuting times also increased by around 30%. So this is common complaint about Cape Town at the moment. Someone sent me an article from the Financial Times just a few days ago, which focusing on Cape Town, saying basically one of the big complaints about people is that they're spending a lot of time getting to work. Partly that's for a good reason, which is the city is fixing roads, but part of it's for a bad reason, which is public transport doesn't work very well. So, Cape Town had, and other parts of South Africa had a well-functioning train network, and that basically disintegrated over the decade between 2010 and 2020. And in large, it's now come back. So then fancy new trains. If you want to walk down to the train line, it's a 10-minute walk. We have nice-looking new trains. The old ones were from the 1980s, and those trains work well and are surprisingly very cheap. But basically in other cities, Durban, interestingly, partly because of climate change, flooding and washing away of train lines, and also because South Africa is a very unequal place, very poor people are taking away bits of the train infrastructure bit by bit and selling it for scrap. And that's happened to stations and electricity stuff, both in Cape Town and in other places. And I'll be talking a little bit, well, not me, my co-author will be talking about that on Thursday morning in our presentation that I might get to. Okay, so I know something about South Africa, but I know something about Ghana and Tanzania, having spent a bit of time in both of those places. And one thing you notice if you're from a country which has perhaps less wage employment, the Ghana Living Standards Survey, 30% of urban workers are working at home. Okay, so there's not much movement around because 30% of people are working at home, and 45% of urban workers are working within 3 kilometers of home. So you add those together, 75% of urban workers are either working at home or working within 3 kilometers of home. And even in Accra, the capital city, 60% of people are working within 3 kilometers of home. So it's like employment is very localized. And so commuting costs may not be as important, although I guess you could argue that maybe people are doing that because commuting costs are important. So, yeah. And if we think wage employment is something that's correlated with development, more high incomes, perhaps it might be the case that transport costs will become more important as more people engage in wage work. Okay. I think I'm going to skip over monopsony and think about transport policy a little bit. I know there's a session tomorrow on transport policy, but does relate to the labor market. So as I've mentioned, search costs are important and commuting costs are important, and both of those are influenced by the extent of public transport and transport policy. Okay, there's a lot of good reasons to subsidize public transport. Many African cities have basically no or very little public transport. So paratransport, informal transport, depending on where you come from, you can say the name of your minibuses, trotros, dala-dalas, matatus, etc. Most of these are privately owned and operated, and little government intervention, perhaps other than having some kind of license and maybe a certified vehicle, etc. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about in my own fieldwork, so probably not good for my academic career, but anyway, for between 2013 and 2017, I took off Thursdays, took a salary cut of 20%, and didn't work on Thursdays for UCT, thanks to my boss, who didn't seem to mind, or if he did, he didn't say so. I worked for him for 9 years, so hopefully he didn't mind. And the idea was to travel around on minibuses in Cape Town and try and figure things out, partly to build a website to help other people commute, but also trying to figure out how this industry works and doesn't work. And one thing that's clear, at least in Cape Town, can't generalize to other parts of the world, there are huge inefficiencies in how these networks and how the transport system works. So one of them, if you're in a public bus and it has a timetable, you know when it's coming, you can get there. In that sense, it's kind of easy and available, you know when it's coming. On the other hand, most minibuses in Cape Town, you have to wait until it's full, and so there are potentially workers along the road who want to get on your bus, but you want to wait, you want a full bus, you don't want the uncertainty of having potentially 1 or 2 or 3 empty seats for your whole ride. And so what ends up happening, the equilibrium, one could say, is that buses wait until they're full and then they go. And so in Durban and in Cape Town, what you can see is that ends up happening, that people who are outside the city center or the main transport routes commute back in and then out. So if this was a publicly subsidized, organized system, you'd have a bus that picked up people along the way, and in not all routes in Cape Town and in Durban, the cities that I know best, but certainly in some of them, people end up commuting the wrong way and then going out again, which if there was a public system, that I don't think that would happen, or at least it would happen less. And then the other thing is turf wars. So this is probably, South Africa, high crime society, and one aspect of high crime society is basically minibus taxi owners shooting each other over turf. Both intra, so you're getting too powerful within my association, so I'm going to take you out, or there's a rival association that's coming onto our turf and we've got to show them that we're more powerful and going to assassinate the chairperson of the taxi association, as they're called in South Africa. Okay, so sorry, City of Cape Town officials, I know there's at least one of you in the room from the question before. I don't think that transport authorities are influenced enough by economists. I also think they're not influenced enough by anthropologists. And what I mean by that is anthropologists are good at actually figuring out how things work. They go and talk to people and figure that out. And I think often engineers, who often are the people sitting in transport planning, don't do that. They have some assumptions and they don't really understand often how it works. And by economists, I think the externalities of public transport specifically are not something that often planners, I'm not picking on Cape Town, it probably has the best functioning city public transport of any city in South Africa, but it's the one that I know best and I live here, so sorry, City of Cape Town. Recent news article, the city thinks if you came, I'm not sure where you went, on your way in, if you came from the airport, just before you come to the university, just after you come to the University of Cape Town, turn left for Cape Town and University of Cape Town and right to go into town, and there's a hospital there, it's called Hospital Bend. But the city of Cape Town thinks there's another reason why it's called Hospital Bend, because it's dangerous, there's lots of accidents and crashes, quite a steep uphill corner. And the city decided that they are going to reroute the bus rapid transport that's controlled by the city. They're going to reroute these buses in peak times because there's slow moving buses on that corner, and it's going to cause accidents or it's dangerous. Okay, so if you're an economist, you think, but hold on a minute, okay, fine. So the buses won't be going on this route, maybe that's less dangerous, but what's everyone going to do in response? Well, you can imagine that people are going to swap to minibuses, and then you're going to have more congestion because minibuses are smaller, and there won't be as many people in big subsidized bus rapid transport buses. So that's the one thing. They could be taking cars as well. Not everyone who goes in a BRT is limited to public transport. Some people would have cars. And then again, basically, you're going to get more congestion. So I think that's a good example where that was bad, not influenced enough by economists thinking about, okay, so you do this, but that's not the end. Other things are going to happen. I think the other one that's, justifiably, we heard stories about property taxes. Cities have budgets. They need to think about how to spend their money. And one of the things that doesn't directly reflect on the budget, but is important for not necessarily reflecting on the budget of the city, but nevertheless on people's pockets, is the fact that paratransit is probably going to adjust, the price of these is going to adjust if there's competition with the BRT. So a very good example, if you're coming from Khayelitsha into a large area, maybe 20 kilometers outside the city, if you're coming into Cape Town from Khayelitsha, it's actually cheaper to stop maybe 70% of the way in an area not far from here called Mowbray. And why is that? I think I might have got that the wrong way around. It's cheaper to go all the way into Cape Town than it is to stop in a suburb on a different taxi, to stop in a suburb that's maybe 70% of that journey, 60%, 70%. Okay, and so the reason for that, as I can see, is that the bus rapid transport directly competes with the minibuses that go all the way into town, but that you can't get off that bus at Mowbray. So basically there's one route that has a competitor and there's one route that doesn't. And it seems to me that part of the explanation for why the price is more expensive in a route that's only 70% of the distance is that there's competition on the one and not on the other. And this price differential didn't exist 10 years ago when the BRT wasn't operating, and that maybe more than 10 years ago, when the BRT wasn't operating and there wasn't this competition. Basically the price was similar, I think. Okay, another one that I just talked to my third year students about, car bloat. This is common to the US, but definitely I can see this happening in South Africa as well. Vehicles are getting bigger and bigger. In South Africa, if you live in Joburg, that might be because you have gigantic potholes and you need a large car to navigate them. But in Cape Town, the roads are pretty good, and yet cars are increasing in size. I want to protect myself, my children, and so I'm going to get a bigger car. I want to see over you at the traffic light, so I'm going to get a bigger car. And you end up, everyone gets bigger cars, and then you end up with these gigantic vehicles. And I can see that in South Africa. Forget the US, where I know that's happening. Very nice study, though, from The Economist, saying that for every life, I'm guessing they're referencing an academic paper, but I saw it in The Economist, for every life that a larger car saves for the person sitting in the car, 12 lives are lost from injuring pedestrians or other car users. So that's kind of like a stark example. Fine, you protect yourself, but you injure other people. And for the South Africans in the room, I think when I was writing this, I forgot temporarily, because I was so angry about it, that many of you are not from South Africa. So I'm referencing OUTA, which is an organization in South Africa that one of their first things that they started out is fighting cities in Gauteng that tried to implement some, not actually congestion pricing, but it's tolling on roads. And so 15 years ago, cities in Gauteng had brilliant roads, huge investment, and that was supposed to be paid for by tolling. And that's basically been middle-class South Africans saying, no, we don't want to pay for services. I know some of you from Gauteng want to fight me on this, but my take on the matter is we don't want to pay for services, and they were successful. It's quite amazing. We think about poor South Africans protesting, shouting, making their voices heard. Well, middle-class South Africans were very good in Joburg at not paying for services. They managed to convince the government not to. Okay, and again, I think these things require thinking about externalities. Okay, I think I mentioned this, so I'm going to skip over. Okay, some suggestions for PhD students. This was all master students, so this was not primarily for students, but nevertheless, I was told that lots of you are students, and you are from the hands that were raised. So here's some suggestions. I've told you a little bit about my own taxi experience. That was super valuable. I got out, I talked to people, and I really want to plug that you shouldn't just be sitting in front of your computer. You should be going to talk to people. Some of you, that's obvious. Maybe I'm only talking to the economists in the room for whom fieldwork is not as common as it is in other disciplines, perhaps. We have our own knowledge from where we come from, and I think it's good to use that knowledge and then also connect it to the academic literature in the area. You don't need to throw away your own skills, background, knowledge from the places where you came from to be able to do good research. It's nice to be able to put the two together. That works well. I've mentioned a few times in economics, there's lots of work on randomized control trials. These are supposed to be the gold standard of causal inference to be able to get at the effects of things. And I've mentioned a few papers that use those already. They're very expensive to run. We could think about this as the political economy of academic research. They're mostly done by rich country researchers with funding from rich country institutions. And they're positive. As I mentioned, there's a few on search interventions. They're good. They help us to learn things. Nobel Prize winners believe in them, so who am I to say that they're not helpful? But I think there are some very important, particularly for urban economics, but other disciplines, questions about them. What do these things do to the untreated? So you get something good, I don't get something good, so what happens to me? Am I disadvantaged by your advantage? There are ways of doing that. So the transport subsidy that I mentioned, Banerjee and co-author, they basically gave people two different things. One was a card with this specific subsidy to travel on the bus, and the other one just a card with money on it that they could spend it on anything else. So in that sense, mitigating some of that concern, but nevertheless, these do sometimes, you can worry about what happens to the people who are not given something as part of the experiment. And then I think the main fundamental problem is general equilibrium, which means, I mentioned this before, but means what happens if we did this at scale? Fine, we do a little experiment, we give some people a subsidy and others not. How can we think about what's going to happen if this happens to everyone? If everyone gets a subsidy, or if, I think everyone gets their qualification certified, or some terrible conference presentation that I went to, someone gets a little trolley that they can sell eggs on. Okay, fine. So you get a trolley from the government that helps you to sell boiled eggs on the side of the road. Great. If you give that to everyone, probably not going to be nearly as effective as if you just gave it to some people. Okay. As I said before, I think it's good to use your eyes and ears. As I said, these are perhaps aimed at economists. You'll see I mentioned Status. This is a common software package that economists sometimes use, and I think sometimes sitting on your computer for 8, 9, 10, or whatever hours a day as a PhD student actually hinders you from understanding the world. So I think talking to people, listening, that's underrated, asking about the things that matter, and talk to your lecturers, professors who know your context, and try not to overclaim that you've solved the world problems, but I'm sure your supervisors are telling you that anyway. Okay. If you're in economics, I would suggest not to focus on causal questions above all else. I think simple description is sometimes underrated. It's good to just know how things are if we don't already. And it might also help you to answer causal questions if you do want to answer them later. Okay, so just some very simple research ideas for, if you're thinking about urban economics, labor economics, How have things changed over time? Where are people working? How much they're earning? The hours that they're spending in work and getting to work, and how are they getting there? And how much are they spending? Probably this is going to come from household surveys in the most case. That's the kind of data that I've used the most. But there is data on firms. Might be asking firms, how do they recruit? How do they select? Is that easy? Is it difficult? How much do they spend on recruiting employees? Measurement issues are also really important. I mentioned that Donovan paper. This is published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. If you're not in the economics club, that's one of the better economics journals, top 5 journals in the world. I searched in vain for the phrase measurement error. I use panel data myself. They keep re-interviewing the same people and asking how things are changing. Remember, I was talking about slippery job ladders, people sliding up and down when they keep interviewing people. And there's some serious problems with those kind of panel data. I'll just give you an example that I know from South Africa, of people who said 3 months ago that they're not employed, and they're employed now, and we came back 3 months later. When they were asked 3 months later, how long have you been in the job, 50% of them said more than 3 months. Okay? So you can imagine that what's happening here is not potentially, I haven't investigated this for their 30 countries, but anyway, what you can imagine is some of what looks like movement is just measurement error. And so who knows if that changes their results? I haven't investigated that. I don't plan to. But just the idea that, thinking about measurement when we're investigating whatever issues it is, I think are important. And then clearly and obviously changes in transport policy and how these affect the labor market is clearly crucial, and you'll know the context in which you're in and whether that's interesting or doable. I think there's lots of new data, potentially new skills that you might have to learn, or I've had to learn, that expands the possible research areas in which you can work. Administrative data are now available for a number of African countries. I think Zambia, I don't know about publicly, but certainly I'm seeing papers on admin data from Zambia. I think Uganda as well, certainly for South Africa. UNUIDA has been influential in trying to get this data available. There's a paper by Harris and Jan Bruckner and co on South Africa on backyarding, which lots of people have written about, but the idea that how densification is happening in South African cities is primarily by publicly provided housing. It's called RDP for the government program from 1996, in which that policy was implemented. South Africa's had a massive public housing provision, several million houses, I think, provided, and those come with a yard. They're not in like multi-story buildings with lots of people. They're primarily in a yard with a yard and one plot. And so what people do to rent out, they construct shacks in the backyard and they rent those out. And that's like a crucial way that urbanization, densification in urban areas is happening. And that paper investigates thinks about theorizing of backyarding and how that's related to employment access. You might pay a bit more to live in a backyard shack if that's well located near public transport or nearer to jobs. There's also firm data. The World Bank is trying to force East African countries to release data to the public. I think their press release wouldn't make it sound like that, but that's what's happening. And there's Kenyan firm censuses, although they don't have any location data, that I've just noticed on the Kenyan Bureau of Statistics website. Sometimes, unfortunately, who you know matters, and sometimes actually being a local might hurt you rather than hinder you. It's very easy if you come from a rich country, from an impressive-sounding university, to get access to data or to present yourself as very impressive to the stats office. You might walk out with treasure that local researchers might not be able to get. So that's a word of warning / cynicism. Okay. So I think I've been speaking for just under an hour. I'd like to have a little bit of discussion, so I'm not going to say anything first. I thought 8 people, maybe you want to reduce that given the way that the seating is, but talk to a few people around you. if your PhD is in this area, at least broadly, that I've been speaking about, it would be good if you could go first and tell people what you're doing. And then everyone else, you're welcome to come in after that with your own ideas or thoughts on the presentation, or if you didn't like the presentation, you can talk about whatever you want to. So then what we'll do is maybe briefly you gather some questions or comments or thoughts, and then you can perhaps nominate someone in your group to speak about those, and then we'll also have some more broader Q&A and discussion time after that. I've been told that we have 5 minutes left officially, and then I said, well, we started 5 minutes late, so can I claim those 5 minutes as well? So that means we have 10 minutes. So I was hoping for a bit more time, so maybe just 1 or 2 questions from each group, or comments or thoughts. They don't have to be questions. And then, yeah, I think then we'll call it the end of the session.
Thank you. This is just some points that I captured from our discussion, but didn't have enough time to refine the questions. But the first one was with regards to remote jobs and how people have been. Oh, I think you mentioned as well throughout the presentation how people have been mostly working from home, and there's this entrepreneurial spirit as well across Africa, if you could say. So, but we are also looking at how does that affect the labor markets and the transport policy, and if there is less need for more transport policies if people are adopting remote work. And what about the digital job searches? Because we're talking about LinkedIn and how these platforms, or Indeed, how these platforms have helped people find jobs, so get access to that information, and perhaps share or signal like they skills to recruiters with much ease. And as the second point was about how the subsidies and support in transport did not help people find or retain their jobs, but like just helping signaling and matching. But would there be a way to helping job or use the strategies for increased job retention or career progression so that people don't fall again on that ladder? And the last one that I could capture was about the labor markets and how they perform or are affected by the surge of smarter cities and so on. So what is the role that the labor markets have in adopting to smart cities?
Great. Okay, I'll try and answer a few of those. Some I won't have answers to, so I'll just say pass. Remote jobs, super important. I would say in maybe large cities in South Africa, maybe a few other large cities across the continent. For the vast majority of cities, I don't think that's important at all in Africa. I just don't think that there's that many people doing remote work. Working at home, yes, but that's not the same as remote work. So so I think that's people working at home are mostly doing self-employment. So yes, that's important. I did say, if lots of people are not actually moving for work, then that does affect how we think about transport policy, subsidies, the labor market, etc. Digital search, yes. So that's an important point. These papers, interestingly, are not that old. So these people were spending money, probably this money 5 years ago. LinkedIn's been around and popular for at least 10 years, maybe more than that. So yes, LinkedIn is important. There's another paper, the Carranza paper, and those co-authors that have basically, one of their interventions was, hey, do you know about LinkedIn? Let me help you use it. That was what they did. Forgot the results, so I can't, you can go and you can ask me afterwards. The problem with also digital search is it doesn't necessarily improve matching, because now a firm's got 1,000 job applications where previously they had 5. So how are they going to decide? Is someone going to go through all 1,000? Are they going to flip a coin and decide whether to go for the first 500 or the first 50? I don't know. So, okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm skeptical, but okay, fine. If you think AI is going to solve that problem, all right, cool. I think that's as many good answers I can get to those questions, and I'd like to hear a few more questions also. Another group want to ask? Yes, okay. Microphone is coming.
Hello, I'm Carla. I'm from the University of the Western Cape. I have a background in anthropology, so appreciate your comment on anthropologists. But I just wanted to ask a bit more about like urban form and urban labor markets. So it was interesting what you were saying about Ghana and how people don't really need to travel that far for work. It's 3 kilometers or they're working from home. I think it's interesting to like contrast that idea a little bit with like the idea of the 15-minute city, which sometimes gets like a lot of flack for being like too European or something. But I honestly think if we're talking about where you can find work, how far you need to travel, it's really important. And then in South Africa, if we look at our urban form, it's obviously very artificial because of apartheid, but we have certain areas that are almost like labor deserts. So like, for example, this is very local, but Ocean View, like it's like a previously colored area, not a lot of even informal opportunities to work.
Yeah.
But then if you go to somewhere like Khayelitsha or even Masi, which is down the road, the informal market is really different. So I was just wondering if you have anything to say about that.
Thank you to everyone. My name is Pogazi from the University of Forte. Just one question as we were discussing with my team. So you want to know the effects of recruitment agencies on the matching friction. So do recruitment agencies decrease the matching friction or do they increase it? Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. So I think I corrected myself a little bit, but thinking about Ghana and people not needing to travel, it might be that that's the outcome, that they could do better. Like that might be a sign of something not working rather than that being a good thing, potentially. I mean, obviously, I've written about how commuting costs are long, and there's a paper by Stutzer and Frey saying that basically of a whole lot of activities, commuting is like the worst one. In terms of the thing people don't like, commuting is like way high on the list of things that people don't like. So I'm not sure how much that is influenced by sitting in a car versus maybe sitting on a nice train and reading a book, or, you know, so I'm not sure about that. But just to say, yeah, I think, you know, I think it would be nice if we live closer, and part of that relating to urban form is just if the city was denser. That if, you know, and obviously as a South African, that's if is just, you know, so far from reality given the long and, you know, very terrible history of how cities were shaped, as Ivan very briefly mentioned. So I think, you know, I'm one of the people, maybe unpopular view, there's a very large building, huge, in fact, gigantic, like hundreds of new apartments, very large office block, not very far from here. I don't know if that's part of the study tour, but what is it called? Pardon? No, it's in Observatory. Basically, it was people used to play golf there, golf course and stuff. And now it's just monster. Amazon is there also, Amazon building that gets people's back up. I think it's brilliant. It's like offices and stuff happening, not 30 kilometers in the very far north of Cape Town or in Stellenbosch Business Park somewhere, but actually offices and homes living close to where, or closer to sort of where things exist at the moment. And I think that's a challenge, is how do you do that? Yeah, I guess I like the idea of the 15-minute city. That's not a South African city though. Recruitment agencies, yes. I don't know whether they. I'm sure to some extent they do decrease. It's also one of those things like, okay, well, who benefits and who doesn't? So, you know, if this is a firm, okay, then who are the firms that want to recruit and which are the ones that don't, and how are they making that decision? So I think that was probably a short way of saying I don't really have a very good answer. And someone here is telling me that I need to complete, so sorry for those who didn't get to air their questions. You're welcome to come and chat to me afterwards, or anyone else if you feel like you need to air your views.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. There's a chocolate and a book. Pleasure.